My name is Melissa Hart. I'm 42 years old, and last week my own sister tried to reduce me to nothing in the middle of a crowded bank lobby. All I needed was $100, one simple withdrawal, something I'd done 1,000 times before. But the moment she saw me step up to that counter, everything shifted. Her eyes sharpened, her smile curled, and she decided that humiliating me would make her morning more entertaining. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't hesitate. She wanted everyone within 10 feet to hear exactly how pathetic she believed I was. And for a few seconds, I stood there frozen, feeling that familiar sting I'd carried since childhood, the one that always came from her direction. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to walk away before I gave her the satisfaction of reacting. So I did. I turned, stepped back into the lobby, and let her think she'd won. What she didn't know was that she had just chosen the single worst moment in her life to test me. Because while she believed she was belittling a sister with barely enough in her account to pull out $100, she had absolutely no idea who she was actually talking to, or what I had the power to move with a single request. 2 minutes later, when I made that request, the entire bank went dead silent. Before I tell you what she said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. There's a reason that moment in the bank cut deeper than it should have, and it reaches back much farther than adulthood. I learned early what it meant to be the daughter who blended into the corners of her own family. It wasn't intentional at first. It was simply the way habits formed and never loosened their grip. My father, Robert Hart, always gravitated toward confidence, speed, and loud victories, traits he admired most in people and, unfortunately, only saw in my sisters. My mother, Linda Hart, loved the appearance of harmony more than the truth it was supposed to represent, so she amplified whatever made the family look polished from the outside. I felt the weight of all that before I ever understood words like hierarchy or favoritism. One birthday stands out more sharply than the rest. I had worked for days on a handmade scrapbook, filling each page with small drawings and fragments of moments I thought mattered to us. I believed it would be enough, an honest gesture from a quiet child trying to be seen. But when I placed it on the table, attention shifted instantly to what my older sister, Sabrina Hart, had given. Something store-bought, shiny, and expensive. She didn't even present it with intention. She simply let the price tag do the talking. My other sister, Jenna Hart, followed with a set of coordinated gifts she said she put together herself, though everyone knew she had used money our parents slipped her earlier in the week. The room warmed with admiration for them, and I watched my scrapbook sit untouched beside a half-empty glass. Moments like that didn't come with explosions. They arrived quietly, accumulating into a steady certainty. Effort didn't matter unless it glittered. I carried that truth into every dinner, every holiday, every report card. Sabrina was praised for ambition. Jenna was adored for charm. I learned to occupy the silent space between them, never enough to warrant criticism, never enough to earn real applause. The only person who challenged that pattern was my grandfather, Edward Hayes. He had a way of noticing the small details most people stepped over. He paid attention to how I organized things, how I analyzed patterns without realizing it, how I stayed calm in situations that made others frantic. When he grew older, he invited me to help him review household ledgers, rental receipts, and old financial notes he kept stacked in labeled shoeboxes. He didn't frame it as training, but it became the foundation for everything I would do later in my life. Before he passed, he gave me a plain wooden box with a brief note folded inside. The handwriting trembled, but the message didn't. In it, he asked me to keep what mattered safe, his way of telling me that value wasn't always meant to be obvious. I didn't know how much that single gesture would anchor me, especially when the people who should have cared most seemed determined to look straight through me. After he was gone, I remained the only one who ever checked the numbers he left behind. My parents assumed Jenna was helping with the household accounts once she grew older, mostly because she told them she was, and they believed it instantly. She liked playing the part of the responsible daughter, the one with effortless poise, the one who could smile her way out of every flaw. But the ledgers didn't care about appearances, and even then I began noticing transfers that didn't match any obligation. Small at first, almost dismissible, the kind of discrepancies someone could brush away if they wanted to avoid ruining the mood. No one else noticed, and no one asked. Silence made things easier for them, so I kept the findings to myself, storing each detail like a thread I wasn't ready to pull. I didn't understand what it would become, or how far it would stretch, only that something wasn't right. And long before the day I stepped into that bank, the part of me my grandfather shaped had already learned to trust the quiet signals hidden beneath the surface. Growing older didn't grant me distance from the patterns I grew up with, but it did give me the clarity to move in another direction. When I left home, I didn't walk away with a plan. I only had a quiet determination to live a life shaped by something other than comparison. My first apartment was barely large enough to hold a bed and a desk, yet it felt like the first space where I didn't have to shrink myself to fit anyone else's expectations. That small freedom mattered more than the size of the place. Work became the structure that grounded me. I started as an entry-level analyst in a modest fintech company, the sort of role that required patience and long hours. I didn't mind the repetition. The spreadsheets, the modeling tools, the slow accumulation of data, they made sense in a way people rarely did. I learned to identify inconsistencies faster than most. I learned to predict shifts before interns even finished running initial tests. For the first time, ability mattered more than presentation, and that gave me a sense of stability I had never been offered at home. My supervisors noticed my consistency, but they never understood the deeper part of it, the instinct to examine every detail the same way my grandfather once taught me. That instinct guided every project I touched. Precision gave me confidence, and confidence gave me ownership over the work I produced. It wasn't ambition that fueled me. It was relief. I finally had a space where I wasn't fighting to be visible. A few years into that job, I met Lucas Grant, an outside consultant the company brought in to restructure one of our predictive tools. He was sharp, composed, and uninterested in office politics, which immediately set him apart from nearly everyone else in the building. He recognized my approach to problem-solving within minutes. Instead of asking me to justify myself, he asked me what patterns I thought the team was missing. It was the first time someone treated my perspective like an asset instead of a quiet afterthought. Our collaboration began with late nights refining a model the company had been struggling with for months. Lucas approached data with an unusual combination of logic and patience, and our skills aligned naturally. Working with him never felt like competition. It felt like two steady currents moving in the same direction. When the revised project produced results far beyond projections, management praised the department as a whole. Neither of us cared. Recognition wasn't the driving force behind any of it. Eventually, Lucas proposed something neither of us had said aloud before: building a system of our own, not a product for a corporation, but a framework we could shape from the ground up, without interference or shortcuts. The idea wasn't glamorous. It was methodical, slow, and demanding, built on clean architecture and long-term stability. We poured everything we understood about financial behavior into it: patterns, volatility, the subtle signals buried inside datasets most firms ignored. Piece by piece, that system evolved into a private investment engine. Its strength wasn't speed or risk, it was accuracy. The more it learned, the more precise it became. We reinvested every gain, letting the structure expand at its own pace. Lucas handled the legal infrastructure while I focused on refinement. Neither of us disclosed ownership, and we kept the entire operation quiet. Privacy gave us space to make decisions on our own terms. Years passed, and the fund grew far beyond anything I had imagined when we first started. I didn't measure its success by the number attached to it. I measured it by the independence it allowed me. No one could treat me as insignificant if they never knew the scope of what I controlled. Silence became a protective shield, one I held firmly, even as the life I built drifted farther from the family that once defined me. I didn't view it as revenge or rebellion. It was simply the steady construction of a life shaped by my own judgment, not anyone else's assumptions. And for the first time, I understood that building something quietly could be far more powerful than competing loudly for validation that was never meant for me. The shift toward everything that followed began with something small and ordinary. It was a Thursday morning when Mrs. Evelyn Moore, my elderly neighbor, called to ask if I knew anyone who could help her with a broken heating unit. Her voice carried the strain of someone trying not to sound worried, but there was no hiding the discomfort she felt living alone in a cold apartment. The repair service she contacted insisted on a cash deposit before sending anyone out. Their request wasn't unreasonable, yet it was more than she could manage that day. I told her I would take care of it. It wasn't a favor that required thought. It was simply what you do for someone who has treated you with genuine kindness. I grabbed my bag and left the apartment, expecting no more than a quick errand before returning to work. The bank was only a short drive away, and I walked inside with the easy assumption that the transaction would take a minute or two. My mind was already on the rest of the day, the deadlines waiting for me, the messages I needed to answer, the model I planned to revise later that evening. Everything was practical, measured, routine. But the moment I stepped into that lobby, I saw Sabrina Hart across the room, her posture rigid with the self-importance she had cultivated for years. She stood near the manager's station, scanning the room as if it belonged to her. She didn't see me at first, which gave me a second to steady myself. We hadn't spoken in months, but the distance hadn't softened anything between us. If anything, it had made her confidence in her own authority grow sharper. When she finally spotted me, the look on her face shifted with a speed that revealed more truth than she intended. It wasn't surprise. It was irritation, followed quickly by the familiar judgment she never bothered to conceal. I walked toward the teller line, focusing on the task at hand, but she moved across the floor with deliberate steps, arriving beside me before I could speak. There was no greeting. She went straight into assessing me as if I were an inconvenience she needed to categorize. I only wanted $100. It was not a complicated request, and I stated it plainly, but Sabrina reacted as though I had asked for something outlandish. Her expression tightened, and her voice carried a certain performative sharpness, chosen specifically for the audience standing nearby. She didn't direct her words to me so much as toward the room, inviting strangers to witness the contrast she believed existed between her polished position and the sister she never took seriously. The sting didn't come from the money. It came from the way she framed the moment, as if my presence alone disrupted the order she worked so hard to project. I felt the eyes around us shift, not with malice, but with the passive curiosity of people who had no idea what they were stepping into. Sabrina thrived in those moments, the ones where she could assert her advantage without saying anything explicitly cruel. Her talent was never in confrontation. It was in making humiliation feel like an administrative detail. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't even let the frustration surface. Instead, I stepped aside, letting her believe she had re-established whatever hierarchy she imagined existed between us. She returned to her station with a satisfied posture, convinced the moment was closed. For her, it probably was. I sat down on one of the waiting chairs, not out of defeat, but because I needed space to think. I opened my laptop, not caring whether anyone noticed. The familiar interface of the system Lucas and I built appeared with each keystroke, steady and controlled. Seeing it reminded me of the life I had constructed far beyond the boundaries of moments like this. While Sabrina measured power in titles and posture, mine lived in the structure I carried with me, invisible to anyone who chose not to look deeper. Nothing dramatic happened in that instant. No sudden reveal. No conflict escalating in public view. It was just a quiet recognition that the balance between us had never been what she believed. And as I studied the data spread across my screen, the noise of the lobby faded until it became nothing more than background texture, unimportant and easily filtered out. What happened next unfolded with a kind of precision that didn't need urgency to feel decisive. I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the screen settle in front of me, absorbing the numbers that had become so familiar they felt almost like pulse rhythms. The system was stable, steady, and entirely under my control. I didn't have to make any dramatic gestures. I only needed to initiate a routine action that carried far more weight than anyone in that lobby could imagine. I logged into the administrative panel of the fund, verifying the most recent reports and confirming the balance across the accounts. The figure displayed wasn't something I dwelled on. It was simply the result of diligence, of years spent refining strategies that rewarded patience rather than spectacle. Lucas and I built it to function quietly, and it did. Yet on that day, its quiet strength served a different purpose. I initiated a standard withdrawal request, the kind usually made between institutional partners, not individuals. The system automatically generated the notice that would be sent to the regional office of the bank's parent corporation. Nothing about the process was dramatic. It was procedural, the sort of action that ordinarily moved through channels without drawing attention, but the number attached to the request, $3.8 billion, did not pass through channels unnoticed. I saw the first sign of disruption in the immediate response. The system flagged the receiving institution for verification, not because of error, but because the size required executive-level clearance. Seconds later, the lobby's atmosphere shifted. Employees glanced toward their monitors with expressions that didn't match normal workflow. Two tellers exchanged worried looks. A message popped onto a supervisor's screen, prompting him to step away from his desk. Sabrina, from across the room, noticed the shift before she understood it. Her posture changed as she tried to assess the situation, a familiar tension forming in her shoulders. For a woman who thrived on control, uncertainty was something she could never mask. She moved toward the nearest employee, asking a low, insistent question. I watched her eyes narrow as the answer reached her, not in detail, but in implication. Within minutes, a man in a tailored suit entered the lobby, carrying the energy of someone whose morning had been abruptly rerouted. He scanned the room with deliberate efficiency until his gaze stopped on me. Then he approached with a measured calm that contrasted sharply with the growing unease around him. He extended his hand and introduced himself as Daniel Cho, the regional director overseeing the bank's operations. It was the first time I had met him, yet the respect in his tone was unmistakable. He didn't ask why I was there or question the legitimacy of the transaction. He only asked whether I preferred to speak privately. His professionalism wasn't performative. It carried the weight of someone who recognized the significance of the request I had submitted. Sabrina's reaction, on the other hand, unfolded slowly and painfully. She looked from Daniel to me, her confusion deepening with each detail she failed to connect. The hierarchy she understood suddenly shifted, and she struggled to place herself within the new structure. Her authority, which had felt so secure only an hour earlier, no longer anchored her. Daniel asked if I needed anything else before he stepped away to coordinate the transfer. I told him no, keeping my voice even. I didn't need to raise it or emphasize anything. The transaction spoke for itself. He nodded once, acknowledging that clarity, then left the lobby to notify the corporate office. Silence filled the space he left behind. No one knew exactly what had happened, but they sensed the imbalance. Sabrina remained still, caught in an internal conflict she couldn't resolve quickly enough. I didn't offer explanation or comfort. I simply closed my laptop, placed it in my bag, and stood. Nothing I had done was impulsive or emotional. It was an administrative decision, executed through the channels built for such purposes. But in that room, surrounded by people who measured influence by title or uniform, the impact reshaped everything they believed about power and proximity. And without a single confrontation, the dynamic that once defined my place in that family began to fracture in silence. The transition from disruption to consequence happened with a steadiness that left no room for misinterpretation. After Daniel stepped out, the lobby settled into a tense hush. No announcement was made, yet everyone sensed that something significant had shifted beneath the surface. I remained standing, letting the weight of the moment settle exactly where it belonged. There was nothing more I needed to do. Minutes later, Daniel returned and motioned for me to follow him. He led me toward the glass-walled office that belonged to Sabrina Hart, its door still slightly ajar from her rushed movements earlier. The expression on her face had hardened into something brittle, part disbelief, part dread, held together only by the image she had taken years to craft. She stepped aside as we entered, though her hesitation revealed how little control she felt over her own space. Daniel closed the door behind us and took a position near the desk. He carried a folder containing printed documentation of the transfer request, along with system logs confirming the origin and scale of the transaction. He didn't present them with theatrics. He simply placed them on the desk as though handling any other matter requiring his oversight. That composure made the situation even clearer. The bank's attention had moved entirely away from Sabrina's authority and toward the person she had dismissed without a second thought. I sat in the chair across from her desk, maintaining the same calm I had carried through the lobby. Daniel remained standing, his posture respectful yet firm. He explained, in concise terms, that the request I submitted activated the highest tier of internal review. His tone didn't waver as he added that the system flagged the branch for procedural risk due to earlier conduct. He didn't specify whose conduct. He didn't need to. Sabrina tried to speak, but her voice didn't cooperate. The confidence she relied on for so long pressed against circumstances she couldn't navigate. She looked from Daniel to the folder, then to me, searching for a point of stability. None appeared. Her understanding of hierarchy could not be reconciled with the reality forming around her. Daniel continued outlining the steps required for compliance. He explained that the parent corporation demanded an immediate internal assessment, starting at the managerial level. His language remained professional, but the implication was unmistakable. Sabrina stood at the center of the investigation. She listened, barely breathing, as each detail landed with increasing weight. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. My presence alone contradicted every assumption she had carried into our earlier interaction. The authority she believed she possessed dissolved under scrutiny she never expected to face. When Daniel finished, he asked if I had any additional concerns that required documentation. His question wasn't rhetorical. It was an acknowledgement of the position I held within the structure he represented. I stated only that I expected accuracy and accountability. There was no accusation in my voice, only a steady clarity. Daniel nodded, recognizing the boundary as both reasonable and binding. He then turned to Sabrina, informing her that she would be placed on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. The words fell with a quiet finality that left no space for negotiation. Her reaction unfolded in slow, visible stages. Shock arrived first, tightening her features. Then fear settled behind her eyes, heavy and unmasked. She tried to cling to the authority she once wielded, but there was nothing left to anchor it. She attempted to speak again, but emotion fractured every sound before it formed. The image she relied on for years, polished, commanding, untouchable, collapsed in the span of a few breaths. Daniel ended the meeting by gathering the documents and offering a brief, respectful nod in my direction. He opened the door and stepped out, leaving Sabrina and me alone in the room. I didn't move immediately. The silence between us stretched, filled with everything she had never considered possible. She stared at me, not with anger, but with the dawning realization that the ground she stood on had never been as solid as she believed. I rose from the chair without urgency and walked toward the exit. There were no final words to exchange, no explanations to provide, no closure to offer. The situation spoke for itself, and the consequences belonged to her alone. I stepped back into the lobby, leaving the office behind without looking back. Outside, the air felt still, neither triumphant nor heavy. It carried only the clarity that comes when long-standing patterns meet their natural end. My phone began vibrating the moment I reached the parking lot, a steady stream of calls and messages lighting up the screen. Their timing was not surprising, but each notification confirmed something undeniable. The impact of that moment had already begun traveling through my family, long before I chose whether to answer. The messages kept arriving long after the sunlight shifted across the driveway. Each alert carried a different name, but the pattern behind them was the same: urgency, panic, and a sudden desire to reconnect. I didn't answer. I needed space to understand the quiet forming inside me, a quiet that came not from victory, but from release. By late afternoon, my mother called again, her voice leaving a voicemail filled with anxious tones. She insisted we speak in person, insisted the situation had spiraled far beyond anything she understood. She didn't mention Sabrina directly, but concern dripped from every word. I agreed to a meeting not because I hoped for resolution, but because clarity sometimes required witness. I gave her a time and told her to bring the rest of the family. When evening arrived, they appeared at my home, my parents, Jenna and her husband, Christopher. They paused at the doorway, absorbing the details as though each one rewrote a story they had been telling themselves for years. No one spoke as they stepped inside. Their silence wasn't respect. It was uncertainty, the kind that forms when assumptions meet reality. The dining room table held a simple meal, arranged with intention but without extravagance. We sat, the air tightening around the shape of conversations waiting to form. My father was the first to speak, his tone measured but strained. He asked for my side of the story, though the phrasing carried an expectation that I would justify my decisions. Jenna shifted beside him, restless in her seat, her expression carefully arranged. I listened, letting each question settle before responding. Then I reached for the folder I had placed at the end of the table. It held documents tied to the family trust: bank statements, invoices, and digital records that outlined transactions made by Jenna over the past 2 years. I presented them without embellishment, sliding the papers toward my father. He hesitated before leaning in to examine the details. His eyes narrowed as he read through the figures, then the signatures, then the discrepancies. The room thickened with attention no one could dilute. Jenna tried to maintain composure, but her hands betrayed her, tightening around the edge of her chair. I explained the findings plainly. Money from the trust had been withdrawn in small increments, funneled through a fabricated vendor account created under her name. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. The evidence did not leave room for interpretation. Christopher looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and dawning recognition, his silence louder than accusation. My mother's voice cracked as she tried to speak, but the reality before her disrupted every attempt. She clung to explanations that no longer fit, searching for a version of events that might soften the impact. But the truth sat between us with undeniable weight. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't express anger. I only stated the facts, letting the consequences root themselves where they belonged. My father confronted Jenna with a tone sharpened by disappointment rather than rage. She attempted justification, stress, opportunity, unfair expectations. But each attempt unraveled under the clarity of the evidence. She had taken what wasn't hers, not out of need, but out of entitlement. Christopher stood, stepping away from the table with a heaviness that suggested the beginning of a fracture he couldn't repair. My mother bowed her head, the realization settling in that the daughter she defended so fervently had been hiding a different story altogether. When the silence grew still enough to hold its own shape, I spoke the words I had carried for years. I told them I was stepping away, not just from the conflict, but from the family structure that had defined me only by what I could provide or endure. I didn't blame them. Blame required attachment. What I felt was distance, steady, and final. My father attempted to negotiate, urging reconsideration. My mother pleaded for understanding, insisting that families repair damage rather than abandon it, but their pleas reached a place that no longer held obligation. I stood, gathering the folder and my resolve. I told them the trust would be handled legally, that communication going forward would occur through formal channels. They could respond or not. Their choice no longer bound me. I walked them to the door, not out of ceremony, but closure. They stepped into the night with expressions shaped by consequences they hadn't anticipated. Jenna avoided my eyes, carrying the weight of exposure with no refuge left. When the door closed, a steadiness settled across the room. It wasn't triumph. It was freedom, the kind built through boundary rather than retaliation. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded across their own timelines. Jenna faced disciplinary action at her workplace after internal auditors reviewed her financial activity. Her marriage strained under the weight of disclosure. My parents stepped back, uncertain how to navigate a relationship no longer defined by unquestioned loyalty. As for me, clarity found room to grow. I invested time into work that strengthened community programs, projects built on trust rather than expectation. I built connections with people who valued presence rather than performance. Looking back, the lesson wasn't about wealth or power. It was about choosing integrity over proximity, peace over pattern, and self-respect over inherited obligation. Sometimes the most necessary departure is the one made without anger, only understanding. Thank you for listening to my story. If it stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What choices have shaped the boundaries in your life? Feel free to share, and if my journey resonated, consider supporting the channel. It truly means a lot.